Just, Nick, I wonder which planet you're on at the moment, mate. I really do. Inflation, well over 12%. Food inflation, much.
And it's because these people only think in terms of numbers on graphs rather than the actual real situations that people are living in, they have to go through every day in this country. But when you're so out of touch as Nick Gibb is, that even Ian Dale, Thatcherite extraordinaire, is castigating you on your lies about the economy, it's worth at least some amount of introspection.
Anthony, hello, what would you like to ask?
Oh, Ian, hello everyone. It's if the Sun project fails and Labour fails to win the next general election, what next for Labour?
You think that's a serious possibility?
Yeah.
Why?
Well, you can't assume they're going to win. Look at 92. Don't ever assume anything in politics.
I'm not sure Labour was so far ahead in 92. He says, looking at Jeremy Corbyn, I don't remember.
They were ahead, I can't remember the
ahead,
figures.
but not 20 points ahead, although the lead is narrowing a little bit. Sarah Olney, let's come to you first on this. If the Starmer project fails and he doesn't win the general election, what's next for Labour? Or don't you care?
I wouldn't say don't care, because clearly they're the principal opposition, and if we're going to have a new government, then we would expect them at least to be leading it, if not to be the majority party. I'm not going to make any secret of the fact that after the next general election, I very much want there to be a non-Tory government in number 10, because I think that the Tories have done so much damage over the last 8 years. I think a lot of things are going wrong.
That's the thing, is that fundamentally I agree that school should fundamentally be a tool of social mobility, right? It should be a tool of just, in general, having a more educated population, because that should bring you basic utility with it regardless. And second of all, using it correctly as a tool for social mobility. But people on the right don't see it that way. People on the right literally only see it as a fuel for future economic growth. And the well-being, the holistic well-being of the students that actually engage in it is of no concern to any of these people. And you saw it from that panel, where it's just like, all the Nick Gibb was saying was talking about, oh, well, look at all these different stats that we're doing really well at. Look at this, look all the league tables that we're doing at. And everyone else in the conversation was saying, well, actually, this is how we can get people to, be able to better themselves, and all the different other applications maths has to be able to get more well-rounded individuals. It's such a stark difference in ideology. If Labour lose the next election, I see Australia's population doubling. I mean, I'd probably want to move to a different country, regardless of whether Labour or the Tories win, to be honest. I'd much rather it be a coalition government between Labour and the Liberal Democrats, because at least the Lib Dems aren't raging transphobes.
In our economy and society at the moment, and I genuinely believe that without the fresh start that a new government can give us, we simply won't have the momentum that we need to make some of the changes that's required. But it's not for me to say what the Labour Party should be up to.
No, but if the lead continues to narrow and there's that Labour doesn't get an overall majority, you know the question that's coming now, don't you? I mean, is this a matter? I know you're not going to say, well, I can't announce what we would do on your programme. I get that, but is this a matter of serious discussion now within the Liberal Democrats? You had your spring conference a few weeks ago. Is that what people were talking about?
We weren't talking about the Labour Party at all. We were talking about the upcoming local elections, where we're very confident we're going to make some progress and win some, council seats, possibly take control of some councils. We're really focused on that. That's really, really important to us. We're talking about our own policies, the things that matter to us that we want to see in our manifesto. And then over the longer term, we're talking about the seats that we hope to win in the general election. We're putting our teams together. We're feeling really optimistic. In those seats where we think we can win, we will be working incredibly hard from now right up to the general election and beyond to persuade people, perhaps who voted Tory in the past, to look at the Liberal Democrats. And that's what we're focused on.
Nick?
Do you know that no Labour government has left office with unemployment lower than when it came into office? So if you want a stable, strong economy, you need to have consistency in a Conservative government. What the Labour Party...
What's interesting as well is that I agree fundamentally that a strong economy is shown by low levels of unemployment, right? But the Conservatives don't agree with this. That's not a Conservative philosophy. In fact, as far as Conservatives are concerned in the way that they create and craft policy, low unemployment is bad as far as they're concerned, because it leads to a hot labour market, which increases the bargaining power of workers against their employers. And second of all, they believe that the inflationary control should be the variable lowest theoretical level of unemployment, the NAIRU, right? Thatcher in government specifically created managed unemployment deliberately as an inflationary control tool. That's not what Conservatives believe in. And also, you look at all the other predictors of a strong economy, like how do people actually live their lives? Are they able to feed and clothe themselves? Those actual, real, tangible benefits of a strong economy. None of those things exist, and we don't even have the economic growth to show from it. It's such a weird number for them to pick as their predictor of a strong economy when there's no growth on a macro level, and on a micro level, people can't afford to put food on their kids' tables. It's such a deranged opinion to have. Please, somebody clip that for me.
Party would have to do when they lose the election
When, as opposed to
year,
if.
yes, is to look at how they manage economies, because the history of the Labour Party is they get into power, they survive on the coattails of the previous Conservative government for 1 or 2 years, so things look quite good, and then their spending gets out of control, the economy tanks, they lose the election, and
The economy has already
rises.
tanked.
I'm thinking about what's happened over the last few years. Yeah, hang on. 13 years, and there are going to be very few people who can look you in the face on the
Thank you, Bilderberg.
doorstep in Bognor and say, I'm better off than I was in 2010.
We have been through some major crises. There's no question about that. COVID was a once in a
Putin! COVID! Blame Putin!
century crisis affecting this country and the world. We borrowed
But
450
COVID is the new winter of discontent. Is it?
Well, we borrowed £450 billion, and we were able to borrow it because of the stewardship of the economy leading up to that point after the banking crisis. And the capital markets were confident enough to lend us £450 billion, and you know they're going to get it.
You have a sovereign bank. You literally you're a sovereign currency issuer. You don't need to rely on there being confidence to lend to the government from the capital markets. That's not how public debt works. I'm going to fucking have an aneurysm. My blood is boiling in my veins as we speak. This is just ridiculous. This is a complete nonsense.
Back, but because of that,
They weren't after Truss's budget in September. They were.
Well, I'm not saying that
Well,
was
literally, and actually, like, if we're going to talk about like the levels of the bond yields, they were record highs during the Conservative government. What the fuck are we talking about?
trying. But what I'm saying is that Rishi Sunak is there, Jeremy Hunt is there. They're stabilising the economy. We did have the fastest growth in the G7 in 2021
You don't now.
and 2022.
We've got the lowest now.
No, but we will recover.
And also, again, it's worth pointing out a reason why we had the highest increase in growth in the G7 in 2021 was because we had the biggest drop. We had the biggest degrowth during the lockdown during COVID, which is fine, but because it's leveled out due to the increase in growth afterwards and the economy coming back to operating capacity, that's not the same as real tangible growth overall, right? I accept that it was good that we managed to get the economy back to where it should be after the pandemic. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but to say that our high growth made us better than everybody else, that's deliberately distorting the facts.
All the hallmarks, all the fundamentals are there in place. We've got low unemployment, we've got inflation coming down, we've got a competent government.
Inflation went up last month.
Yes, but it's forecast by the OBR to be 2.9% in the fourth quarter of this
Do
year.
you seriously believe that's going to happen?
I do, provided, of course, we don't give in to pay settlements where people are demanding 35% pay increases. Of course, that would blow inflation apart. But the point about we were discussing the Labour Party, I just think if the Labour Party lose the election, they've got to look at how they manage economies, because their history, throughout the history of the Labour Party, is the damage they do to the British
So
economy.
under the Blair government,
This is just completely incorrect, right? It's just everything is so fundamentally incorrect in that we had lower growth in the Thatcher period, the neoliberal period, than we did have during the post-war consensus, right? Unemployment was way higher under Thatcher, which is apparently his metric for what a good economy should or shouldn't look like. For example, the inequality massively increased. People's standard of living didn't really massively increase under the Thatcher administration. The Blair government may have gotten people's living standards to increase, but they did that off the back of continual over-privatisation of the economy and loading up the public sector with things like PFI debt, for example, and not instituting the capital controls and prudential regulation that was necessary to stop the financial crisis. Then the financial crisis happened and austerity was introduced, which screwed our economy even further. We have 45 years of conservative governance under neoliberal economic policy, which this guy wants to continue, and to be fair, so does Starmer, and we've got nothing out of it. Low growth, more inequality, very little increase in living standards. He's living on a different planet, a completely different planet, completely rewriting all of history. The last time that we had a strong government was under Harold Wilson, right? And under people like Heath and Macmillan, we still had a stronger government than we have now under the conservative policies, the conservative economic policies of Thatcher, Osborne, and Sunak, for example. I would rather have a Harold Macmillan than a Tony Blair at this point. And I've been open in saying that I would rather have a Harold Macmillan than a Tony Blair. pay settlements don't impact inflation because they do not impact input costs to consumer goods. Literally 100%. Ian, it will happen if the government do nothing. Be a journalist. Unfortunately, he's not a very good one.
Economy was well managed. I mean, then the financial crash came. I mean, we can argue about sort of things that we might have done differently, but it generally was well managed. The financial crash came along. Gordon Brown was seen by everybody outside this country as almost the saviour of the world economy. It doesn't really fit into the narrative.
There was the banking crash.
Even Ian Dale, right? Even Ian Dale, who says that his hero is Margaret Thatcher. Right? His political hero is Margaret Thatcher. Even he has come back to Nick Gibbons saying you just live in fantasy. You literally live in fucking fantasy land. Well, I'm sure Ian Dale only really likes the New Labour people because they essentially embedded Thatcherism into the economy. I'm sure he's only saying that. But when you're so out of touch as Nick Gibbons that even Ian Dale, Thatcherite extraordinaire, is castigating you on your lies about the economy, it's worth at least some amount of introspection, probably.
Of course, but also the way they had spent during that period meant that when we came into office in 2010, we had a budget deficit, an annual budget deficit of 100.
The only government to have run a budget surplus in the last 40 fucking years was New Labour. They were the only people to run a budget surplus, right? The national debt continued to increase under the Conservative government, under austerity. I don't care because I know that the budget deficit is an entirely illusory number. And that has no bearing on the overall strength of the economy. Unlike the Reinhardt and Rogoff shit, this man will continually try and parrot as the reason why austerity was necessary, because somehow once you get above 90 debt to GDP ratio, suddenly the economy should always tank when, there are governments who have higher debts than we do with stronger economies. France being one, Greece, for example, as a percentage of GDP. And they'll then try and tell us that that it isn't raining when we can feel the droplets on our face. Absolutely ridiculous. And the fact that he is being shown to be completely rewriting history, has been said in chat by Ian Dale of all people, just shows that we're literally the surrealist of ideas of public discourse.
£156 billion
what
a
is
year.
It now?
It's
a lot more.
We have been through the COVID crisis and we're trying to deal with that. But that was 11% of GDP that we were spending each year. We had to bring that down. And because of that, we were able to borrow during the COVID crisis.
Okay. Right, let's repeat the question. If the Starmer project fails and he doesn't win the general election, what next for Labour, Jeremy Corbyn?
Well, before I say that, just Nick, I wonder which planet you're on at the moment, mate. I really do. Inflation, well over 12%. Food inflation, much more. More food banks in this country than branches
Jeremy,
of
you're taking
McDonald's.
your pen.
Sorry, it's a very good pen. Given to me by a trade union. You're suggesting that somehow the economy is doing well. Well, if you ask anyone who is worse off than they were 10 years ago, ask anyone like a teacher or a rail worker, a mail worker, what's happened to their wages, they won't be very, very happy. And you cannot say that wages have caused this inflation because wages have actually fallen over the last 10 years. And if you actually got round the table with all the unions involved in the current disputes and paid them properly...
They did borrow and do QE over COVID. As far as I'm aware, both QE and additional government debt were two things that they used to finance furlough. It was a combination of the two. As far as I'm aware, I may be misremembering. Also, our debt to GDP ratio went well down from the multi-high it was in 1945. We're basically never running a budget surplus. We've run 7 surpluses in 45. Yep, 2 of those surpluses came under Blair. 1 came under Thatcher. And I think the rest was all a mix of post-war consensus governments as well. But literally, we continually used Keynesian economics as a driver of economic growth in the entirety of the post-war period. And as I said, the aggregate growth over that period was higher than it has been over the neoliberal period. Neoliberal economics does not work and it's never worked. It's fantasy economics.
Would actually have more money being spent in the economy, which would help investment anyway, and you would have a lot less poverty around and a lot less people claiming universal credit or top-ups in order to get through. Now, for the Labour Party, I think the important thing is to offer a real alternative. And I saw an analysis in the iPaper last week which said one of the problems was many of the public don't fully understand what Labour's economic strategy is because they're so busy presenting themselves as being very good.
Because they don't have one. They don't have an economic strategy. Their economic strategy is you have an iron grip on the nation's finances, which means no spending, more austerity, and no return to the Keynesian consensus. No matter how many times they try and get Mariana Mazzucato in as an advisor for future economic policy, they just ignore her and continue parroting the nonsense lines that are part of the neoliberal hegemonic understanding of the economy that's been essentially unassailable for 45 years.
At managing the economy, surely we've got to look at the structural problems. The structural problems are historic lack of investment. Structural problems are historic lack of training, historic problems of underpayment of teachers and medical workers, many of whom, if they can, emigrate or they go and do something else, even though they've been trained at
You
public
put forward
expense.
that case in 2019.
I put forward that case in
and
2019.
lost.
Of course we lost the election. I fully understand that. But there are many reasons, one of which was issues around Brexit, I'm sure you'd understand. But individually, interestingly, the policies, particularly ones on public ownership of mail, rail, water and energy.
You fucking get them, Jeremy. You get them. You tell them what's for. You show those people where the public's actual belief in these policies lies. You fucking tell them.
Actually all publicly supported and still are. I think what we need is a much clearer alternative in the election.
Is it also down to the fact, I mean, there was a YouGov survey at the weekend which showed that undecided voters, who, as you well know, they decide elections generally, they much prefer Rishi Sunak to Keir Starmer. Now, what do you put that down to?
I think he puts himself across as being, was new, of course, which is what he is, but also he's probably trying to present himself as being financially and politically competent. I don't think he is, but it's an image that has been very carefully constructed.
You get him, Jeremy. You throw him under the bus. Oh, we'd love to see it. Fucking love to see it. We'd love to see him take down Sir Keith Stronger. Yeah, the king dropped his crown, as always. He did indeed, right? He needs to put his crown back on, because that's where it belongs, right? Literally, again, he's correct. Keir Starmer isn't financially competent. Keir Starmer doesn't know anything about economics. When he became the leader of the party, it's well known at this point, he had to get given a crash course in economics by obviously people from the Labour right, who are all neoliberals, so taught him a bunch of economic lies, essentially. Alas, he's talking about Rishi. No! I misattributed some statements there. Well, I'm going to pretend that he was calling out Sir Keith with these statements, because he also is.
Over the last couple of months, but we are very early into his premiership.
So
Can I help?
I wouldn't know you can help me in a moment.
No, hang on a second. Hang on, because you just said you didn't think Keir Starmer was financially or politically
No, I
competent.
didn't say that.
You did say that.
I said the presentation of Sunak was that he was financially competent.
Right.
That's what I said.
All right. I mean, I'm going to pretend that he was saying that about Sir Keith, because it's basically 100% true for both Sunak and Starmer. Identical. Literally identical for both of them as far as policy is concerned, and their understanding of the economy is concerned. Both of them are both trying to present themselves as financially competent whilst not having a fucking clue how the economy works. Ironically, Sunak probably knows more about how the economy works than Starmer does, which is unreal, right? The fact that Starmer was very happy to say low corporation tax has failed, let's increase corporation tax during the leadership election, right? That's far more of a greater understanding of how the economy works than Starmer essentially saying we can pay for everything with a non-dom tax.
I heard you to say that you didn't think Keir Starmer was financially or politically competent.
That is not.
Well, I'm glad to have given you the opportunity to clear that up, because was I alone in hearing that?
He's already been cancelled by Keir.
I thought that was going to be a great newsline, Tory. You've let me down.
I'm sorry to let you down. But my fundamental point is there has to be a real alternative offered, and if there isn't a real alternative offered, people go to the status quo.
A lot
This is
of
what they know.
A lot of your supporters and friends are really angry with Keir Starmer.
The thing is, they actually won't go to the status quo. They'll go to the far right because the far right is offering them something. The far right is offering them a reason as to why things are bad. They won't go to the status quo. They will go to the far right. If the far left, or just the basic left, don't offer an alternative to centrism and centre-right politics, they will go to the far right, who will give them somebody to blame. They will give them solutions to problems, whether they are correct solutions or not. If the Labour Party do not offer actual real solutions, they will lose. That's the truth about it.
Starmer for effectively ditching all the promises that he made when he succeeded you, because his manifesto at that time, and there were 10 pledges, and they were all ones which I think you could have probably bought into.
They were all taken
gone
from the 17 and 19 manifestos. All those 10 pledges were, and I was quite relieved, actually. Well, that's all right. My work has not been in vain, having got those two manifestos
But now you think
agreed
it has
by the
been?
party. Well, if we run away from what I believe were fundamental and reasonable policies to be offered to the British people. I mean, I was interviewed during the 2019 election by a Swedish journalist. He comes into my office, jumps in and says, right, Mr. Corbyn, tell me all about your extreme manifesto. So I sort of gave him a 2 or 3 minute description of what was in the policies. And he said, was that it? I said, well, it's pretty good for this country. He said, we did all that years ago. We've got stable economy, high living standards, good quality social services, good quality education, and a publicly run health service. Why don't you do the same?
Oh, he's so good. Again, actually, I wish we'd seen more of this during the election campaign. Just these policies are sensible. Look what they do, how they're doing everywhere else. This is how you build a good economy, right? It's the economy, stupid. Literally, it should have been the main focus of all of this stuff. And if it had just been really simple, laying out why these policies are good and that people support them. But then again, I guess he never had the time to do so because he was too busy fighting off huge numbers of ridiculous smear campaigns, especially in 2019. It's a real shame. A real shame. But there you go. Rishi, personally involved in causing the 2008 financial crash, Sunak is very economically competent. True. Very true. He's the most... I mean, to be fair, they are economically competent because they knew they'd fucking get away with it. They knew that they could plough all of these billions of pounds and dollars into the subprime mortgage crisis, for example, knowing that they were guaranteed to get a bailout from the government because they were so central to the economy.
When he was elected leader, Keir Starmer on LBC described you as a friend. A few weeks ago on LBC, he says that you were never a friend. When you hear him say things like that, does that...
Makes me sad, actually. I don't know why he says that. I mean, I worked with Starmer. He was in the shadow cabinet. I went to Brussels with him. Yeah, I worked with lots of people.
Did you regard him as a friend?
I regarded him as a colleague. I never regarded him as a friend. I didn't spend time hanging out with him, all that sort of thing. A friend is somebody... go out for a meal with, have a chat, call their house, that thing now. So why he suddenly announced to the world I was a friend, and then a short time later announced I was not a friend? Well, this is primary school stuff.
Samuel.
And he's right, it is primary school stuff, but this is the political discussion that all of the centrists and liberal types wanted. This is the adult politics that the Liberals wanted. No discussions on policy, no proper alternatives, just continual Overton window tightening, bully boy politics from the centre to the centre over meaningless nonsense because it's more electorally viable, right? Appealing to the consensus with very, very minor differences. This is how adults run politics. And the gigantic irony that it never was how adults did politics, it's how children do politics. It's politics for children. And quite frankly, it's ridiculous that centrists and liberal types have deluded themselves into thinking anything else.
Well, this is part of the problem with Keir Starmer, isn't it? And when you compare him to Rishi Sunak, I think most of the public feel like Rishi has a really clear plan about what he wants to do over the next 12 months.
They hear these five pledges and they're motherhood and apple pie.
Well, certainly in terms of...
Jeremy would probably agree with them.
Certainly in terms of stabilising the economy, I think he has a really clear plan. And I think as the months go ahead and people can see that he is as competent as many people already believe he is, he'll be able to put...
What stable economy? How is the economy stabilising, right? How is anyone's conditions improving? Are we not going to have the biggest fall in living standards since records began? Have these things changed? What am I going mad? How is this any different to what we've literally had for the past 3 years? I don't get it. Please show me again. And it's because these people only think in terms of numbers on graphs rather than the actual real situations that people are living in that they have to go through every day in this country. Because they don't speak to normal people, they don't interact with normal people, they don't have conversations with normal people. They have focus groups, right? They have focus groups where they specifically pick the question's wording to make it agree already with their political prescriptions. As we saw from that Labour study about private ownership, trying to make the Stevenage woman look more right-wing than she actually was, according to the really carefully worded questions they asked in their focus groups, for example. But they don't actually spend time on the ground with real people listening to their concerns, which is one thing that Jeremy Corbyn has always done and has done his entire time in office. But if you look at, for example, during the Grenfell situation, who was the MP on the ground making sure everything that was okay, who was being lauded by the residents of that particular area of London for the work that he did? Of course it was fucking Jeremy Corbyn. It's always Jeremy. Spreadsheetonomics is a deadly art of pure concentrate evil. I don't even necessarily disagree that you should at least take into account the numbers with regards to macroeconomics so that we have a better understanding of the whole, of the kind of, again, a broader picture of how the economy is doing. But you cannot do that as the only method while completely ignoring the real lives that people live. Because as Gary Stevenson said, if you want to learn economics, go out on your high street, go speak to people, go find out ask how your mum's doing economically. That's how you understand how economics is doing, how the country is doing economically.
to the public his plan for the country. But the issue with Keir here is, and probably the reason why they're not doing as well as perhaps they could be doing, is he's very
20 points ahead.
Well, in some polls, but the polls are narrowing, is because he's very inconsistent. I mean, he tells you Jeremy was his friend, now he's not. He says he's different from all the politicians, and then you see these weird attack ads. He's just someone that is not very consistent, and therefore I don't think the public will be convinced about him the next time we have a general election. So I completely agree with Nick that actually all bets are probably off at this stage.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Big Al. And again, the biggest new story about treating the red numbers worse than the black numbers, for example, is our discussion around the public debt. Again, basically entirely based off of a flawed study, which was errated and corrected by its own authors, the Reinhardt and Rogoff study from 2008, where they made nonsense statements about how much public debt that you can have as a percentage of GDP without impacting economic growth, for example, was the basis of the entirety of austerity politics for a decade, longer even at this point, quite frankly. And it basically they have a lot of right-wing economics is based upon this idea that the public debt is in the red equals economy bad, which obviously doesn't have any bearing on the overall macroeconomic numbers about economic growth, but also about how it affects people's daily lives and how it affects not just economically but socially as well. For example, I've talked a lot on this program about how neoliberal economics and austerity politics have not just killed people's economic prospects, but it's also made our society culturally worse. Because, as any good Marxist will tell you, the cultural superstructure is always dependent on the economic base. And if anything is, quite frankly, has proven Marxist theory completely correct on this, is the way our culture, the culture and the community of this society has been broken down by economic austerity, right? Where we have become more bitter, more spiteful, more competitive with each other on even basic levels, and it's broken apart the fabric of our society from the base upwards rather than the top down.
Just before we go to the news, what do you think of these attack ads, Jeremy?
Oh, I think it's bad news all round. I think the idea that you say something unbelievably awful about an opponent as a kind of gesture towards them is not very good or very sensible. I do not believe in that sort of thing. I was invited many times as leader to agree and approve similar styles of things, and I just said, no, I'm not going down that road. I'm not going in that direction. I want us to put forward a positive message about the kind of society we want to create. I want people to support and give votes out of hope, not fear.
Do you think in retrospect, though, that was naive? Because, I mean, history shows in Australia and America, negative political advertising can work. Maybe this country's different, I don't know.
And what do you end up with as a result of that, though? Other than a nasty, puerile politics, which is based on how nasty you can be about the other person. Well, you've been there as well. I was once in the US during part of a...
And the thing is, again, we all know what happened, literally. Like, and what's incredible is that now it's, now the attack ads are being done on someone the establishment likes, like Rishi Sunak, for example. Suddenly this is this big problem. Did all of the mainstream media have the same castigation for the posters that were put up on election day in 2019, no less, with Jeremy Corbyn's face on it, saying, "Would you trust this man with your children?" And the MSM ignored it, or at least didn't give it as far as, as wider coverage has been done about these attack ads that Keir Starmer has done, and Keir Starmer's Labour has done on the Conservative Party. Suddenly, it's correct. We shouldn't be doing either of these things. But suddenly there is being actual coverage of this stuff. And, it's correctly being described as puerile gutter politics by people in the media, for example. But only when it's attacking Rishi Sunak. When it was attacking Jeremy Corbyn, he was fair game, because they couldn't be allowed to, have any kind of pro-Jeremy Corbyn position in the mainstream media outlets.
Senatorial election, I think it was in Virginia, and I had nothing to do one evening, so I turned on the television and I watched almost an hour of political advertising. It was the most unbelievable stuff being thrown by candidate A at candidate B and candidate B. At the end of it, is this the best they can do?
I agree with Jeremy to a large extent.
Is this the best you can do?
The biggest issue with those ads is that they were just barefaced lies. There's nothing wrong with them being honest and upfront about the truth or failure, but they were just false, and that's what made them even more cheap and vile and wrong.
Said that public services were in, quote, great shape. My question is, are they really?
Well, Samuel Kasumi, as an aspirant mayoral candidate, let's stick with London public services for now. Everyone else can talk about it nationally. If you're going up to someone on a doorstep, can you really defend the state of public services in London?
it depends on what services you're talking about, and some, for example, your education will be run at a very local level. So I think it won't be a one size fits all. Having said that, we know that these are very tough times for everybody, particularly economically. But this is still one of the greatest countries to live in the world. But this is still one of the greatest cities to live in.
How can you even say that with a straight fucking face? There's nothing good about what's good about living in this country, right? What is literally what's good about living in this country? I genuinely cannot think of a single thing we do better than every other country. Even like the most quintessentially British thing that I love is fish and chips. It's not even British. It's like it was imported by European Jewish people. What's good about it? Like someone in the comments, right? Like Jimmy Anderson. Is that it? The caterpillar cake? There's nothing good. There's nothing good about this country. Right? Is it better to live in the UK than it is in Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Iceland, for example? Just 4 countries off the top of my head: Australia, New Zealand, Germany, France, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Spain, Portugal. Highest density of Indian takeaways? True. I will give you that. I will give you that we have a high density of Indian takeaways. Or Chinese chippies. Right? Basically takeaway food. Food delivery is the only thing. The kind of food delivery that we have access to is the only thing that I like about the UK. There's nothing good. You have to be fucking demented to believe that. Genuinely demented.
In the world. So
what do you say to somebody who has to wait 2 weeks to see a GP? Because that was not the case before the Conservatives were in power. You can blame the pandemic however much you like, but in the end, if people can't get to see a GP and can't get the health advice that they need, you cannot say that public service is in great shape.
Yeah, I mean, look, we're clearly spending record sums of money on our National Health Service, but it's still a challenge for people to get GP appointments and
a record number in headline figures, but not as a percentage of GDP, right? Stop laundering the figures to make it look how you want it to look. Stop lying with facts. It's infuriating. I hate this stuff so much.
For people to get operations, and have long waiting lists. So they're big challenges that certainly we are facing as a country. But I think it is also important to recognise that we are in a fantastic country. And I always tell people that there's a balance and some nuance. Even though we can do better, it doesn't mean that things are all doom and gloom.
Give me one public service that's in great shape.
I mean, I've travelled over the last 2 years since I left my role as Special Advisor Downing Street. I've travelled to a lot of countries across the world. And one of the things I would say is we've got a fantastic transport system, particularly in London. Yes, there's still room for improvement.
What fantastic transport system. London's fine, like it's good. It's definitely the best transport system in the country. Is it better than any European country? Like, come on. Come the fuck on. I genuinely cannot believe the shit that I'm hearing. How is our transport better than Denmark, better than France, better than Germany, right? It costs more to get a fucking return ticket from Manchester to Leeds than you'd pay for a return ticket from Warsaw to Katowice. Like, come on! It's ridiculous. It costs a season ticket from Birmingham to London is more expensive by factors of 10 than a Bahncard 1000 that will give you unlimited transport on the entirety of the German rail network. How on earth can you say that with a straight face? Literally. This is unreal statements to make.
Improvement, but it is.
So you'd like to pay tribute to Sadiq Khan for that?
I'd like to pay a tribute to central government for all the funding for things like the Elizabeth line, and not necessarily Sadiq Khan, who I think could be doing a lot better, of course.
Right, let's just recap the question. The Conservative Party chairman Greg Hand said on LBC yesterday that public services are in great shape. Are they really, Sarah Olney?
Well, it doesn't feel as if they are, to be honest. I would be really interested to hear what his evidence is for that. I mean, certainly in my constituency, we're seeing, we know that the teachers are going on strike next week. Parents across my constituency, myself included, having to take a day off to look after their children. We know the doctors are on strike, the nurses are on strike. Ambulance wait times, I think, are at the worst that they've been. We've got 7.1 million people on NHS waiting lists. You can't register with an NHS dentist anywhere in my constituency. It's really hard to get a GP appointment. I think under the surface, there's lots and lots of people working really, really hard.
Yeah, that's true. Actually, in YouTube chat there, Kieran, it's incredible how he's literally saying, yeah, the best transport that we have in this country is in London, which has state funding and is publicly owned, right? I'm like, okay, brilliant. Why don't we do that with the rest of the fucking rail network?
I want to make sure that that's something that I want to pay tribute to all those people who are doing their very, very best to make it work. But there's no doubt that in all sorts of different areas, it really feels that things are creaking at the seams. And there was a report yesterday about the wait for mental health services for young people, for example. And this is something I see almost as the most critical thing in my constituency: the very, very, very long waits that young people are experiencing.
And again, what's also the problem with this discussion that we have around mental health, for example? I'm going to have a mental health advocate on the stream sometime soon. Someone I covered in a previous video. It's called Ollie's Really Good. The thing about mental health coverage, right, is we always talk about how much money needs to be put into mental health coverage to help young people. And that's fine, that's good, we should be doing that. But we never have a discussion about why. Why is young people's mental health the way that it is? And of course these discussions only ever go one way. Oh, it's the iPhones. Oh, it's the video games. Oh, it's the social media. Oh, they're spending too much time on TikTok, for example. Yet they will never fundamentally answer the real answer to this question, which is young people are depressed and miserable because there's a country where they have no economic prospects, no future vocation staring back at them. They've been sold a lie by the miracle of consumer capitalism will give them prosperity when it hasn't. They are being continually hounded by a media and political essentially environment that treats them like they're absolute dirt even when they're not. Like they're getting told that there's this massive problem with antisocial behaviour amongst young people when antisocial behaviour is at record lows. And on top of that, the world looks like it's going to burn to a crisp because of climate change and the Nazis are back. Like, of course they're going to be miserable if every single new future world that they could envision for themselves looked incredibly bleak and without any kind of future prosperity at all for them. But no, of course it's the iPhones. And then obviously this is all down to the failures of neoliberalism to provide them with a good future, which obviously, is always fucking neoliberalism. And then on top of that, because of neoliberalism failing these people and impacting their mental health through failures of economic policy, base superstructure, as I always say, we then have to spend even more public money to provide mental health services to deal with the mental health damage that we've put on them by failing them as a generation. So again, just as always with neoliberalism, the failure to properly and adequately use public service and to create a strong public economy to deal with everyone's basic needs, we have to spend even more public money to be able to have patchwork solutions over the top that do not fix the fundamental problems of our society.
For mental health services, and it's absolutely crushing. So I just don't know what Greg Hands is looking at when he says they're in great shape. And I think one of the biggest issues for every kind of public service is the workforce issue. And we've talked about this, I think, before, in relation to the NHS, but we're also seeing it in schools. We've just talked about maths teachers, for example. And I think that's the bit that we've really got to focus on. We need to make our public sector an attractive place to work. We need to encourage people to come work in it. We need to address the issues that are causing people to leave. And that's something that we've really got to focus on.
Nick Gibb.
Look, standards are rising in our schools. Since 2010, we're rising in reading of 9-year-olds from joint 10th to joint 8th. In the Pearls International Survey, we're rising in terms of our maths.
Good. Well, looks like they'll be incredibly smart and well-read when they leave and create a far more economically prosperous future for themselves in Denmark or France.
Ability, both in PISA, which is a 15-year-old, and in TIMS, which is a grade year 5 and year 9. So we're doing well in terms of standards in our schools. And I would pay tribute to the 400,000 teachers in our schools who have made that happen. In terms of the health service, we're spending record.
Even cheap supermarket food, the one little bright light in an ocean of gloom, is now gone as well. Well, exactly, MCH. In the young people were actually neoliberalism as an economic policy was sold to everybody that the deregulated consumer capitalism would give people cheap luxuries. It would give them the cheapest luxuries that they could possibly put their hands on, and it was going to be paid for through the marketization of necessities. So the generations who lived through what little boom was made out of neoliberalism, now fundamentally moved to a world in which imported foods from globalization were suddenly cheap. You could go to the supermarket, you could have rows and rows of all these different vibrant fruits from around the world. Holidays became fundamentally cheaper. Consumer electronics were the cheapest than they'd ever been with their common household items. Everyone could have access to these things, but houses were more expensive. Right, water, energy was more expensive. All of these things continue to creep up in price. So because they became the linchpin, the backbone of the ways in which the bourgeois class made money in the economy, and it was always going to bust. And now that it has bust, we don't have the cheap basic things that everybody should have access to that we had in the post-war consensus, and now we don't have the cheap luxuries anyway, right? They sold the boomer generations as a demographic sold out the basic standard of living that they enjoyed for younger people in service of having cheap treats, and now they're telling young people they can't have the treats either, and that's the damning indictment of neoliberalism.
Amounts. As Samuel said, we're spending £152 billion a year
You
now
can
on
say
health
till you're blue in
services.
the face how much you're spending, but if people's own real life experiences are not good, they're going to say, well, something's wrong. You're not spending it wisely.
Well, what's happening in the health service is we are recovering from the pandemic, which was the biggest crisis affecting this country for a century, and there is a backlog in elective surgery and treatments because of that crisis, and we are recovering from that, and that's why the health service is in such pressure. And even as we emerged from COVID, we had a resurgence of COVID and flu and
the worst part about the whole the cheap luxury stuff is that it makes boomers who grew up during the post-war consensus think that kids these days are somehow spoiled. The kids these days, for example, are all middle class because they do things like eat avocados or anchovies or rocket salad, for example, when we all understand how the economy works. We know that, you can buy avocados for 50p in Aldi or wherever it might be, for example. These are not luxury food items. But because the advent of neoliberalism and globalization made these things cheap consumer items, boomers can look at that and go, well, the economy's doing fine. Look at these kids eating their avocado toast and having access to iPhones and cheaper consumer electronics, for example. And it gives them an easy way to be able to brush away our criticisms of the wider macroeconomic problems. When I'm like, I would sell off cheap, I don't even like avocados anyway, they taste like fucking washing up liquid. But I would give away the cheap imported blueberries from Tunisia and the cheap avocados and the cheap consumer electronics. I would sell all of that for affordable housing, for affordable energy, for affordable transport. I'd sell off all of it in an instant, like that. Immediately.
childhood illnesses like scarlet fever as well. All those issues have to be handled by the National Health Service, and that's why we're in this crisis. But in terms of the doctors, there are 37,000 more doctors today than there were in 2010, 52,000.
2,000 fewer GPs.
And in terms of GP appointments, we know that there are almost 2 million more GP appointments this year compared to this time last year. So, of course, there are challenges and struggles, as I said, as we emerge from COVID. But, you know, we are a government that's determined to tackle them, and we are putting in the money, 152 billion.
I mean, to be fair, Australia was basically destroyed by the Liberal Party in that period. And it's even worse now because of Scott Morrison, and obviously Albanese isn't doing anything to fix it either. So Australia's not in a great shape right now, although it's slightly on the way back up. For example, well, I actually disagree that there's going to be a housing crash. Lots of people predicting it. I fundamentally disagree, because there would be a housing crash if we had a normal economy, a normally equal economy. But we don't have a normally equal economy anymore. The oligarchs and the bourgeois in our society have way more wealth and asset wealth, and also liquid wealth in their hands than they ever have done. And lots of it stored up in the property market, for example, far more than ever was previously. The days of housing crashes happening because of ability for people to get on the housing, I think those days are over, because so much asset wealth has been accrued into the hand of so few people who have a vested interest in continually increasing asset pricing of housing. As soon as the prices of houses start to drop, the asset-rich bourgeois class members in this country will then use their liquid wealth that they have access to buy up even more housing to maintain the asset value of the property they already hold. They cannot afford to let the bag drop. So instead of selling off the housing and precipitating the housing crisis, they're going to double down and buy more with cash to make sure that they maintain the price of their assets in future. Because again, they know that it's integral to the economy. They know that it's just like with the banks, for example. The government has a vested interest, not just for the businesses themselves and the rich people who own all this property. They also know that regular members of the country cannot fall into negative equity either. So the government will institute specific policies to ensure house prices rise at the same time as protecting not only the rich investors in housing, but also the regular people who have mortgages. I really don't think there will be the housing crisis that we would usually see at the same time of these economic downturns.
compared to 123 billion in just 2019-20. And these are sizable sums of money that we are putting into our public services. It will take time for them to
Just on schools, why is it proving so difficult to come to an agreement with the unions? Because it wouldn't one way forward, and I put this to one of the panels last week on the health service, why don't you sort of say to the unions, well, look, we acknowledge that you have fallen behind in pay since 2010. We will commit to restore that over X number of years. Do you not just think that would be the right thing to do? Because obviously you're not going to be able to do a massive increase in year one. I think most people would understand that. But to actually commit to recognising that they have a case that they have lost out over that period, that would go some way to at least coming to an agreement in the end, surely.
Well, that's what we've been trying to do. Last year's pay rise was 5.4% on average. This year we were proposing 4.5%. We're also adding £1,000 to last year's pay rise, taking that 5.4 up to about 7.8% in percentage terms. So we are trying to do that within the parameters of making sure that we are doing so in an affordable way and that doesn't generate pressures on inflation, which would be the worst thing. So I'm disappointed by the decision of the four unions to reject the pay
But do you recognise that they have lost out since 2010?
Yes, no, we do. And a lot of public sector workers have, indeed in the private sector too. As we went through all those years recovering from the banking crisis, and then we had COVID, and now we have...
What recovery? We never recovered from the banking crisis. We looked at the banking crisis and said, let's bail out the banks, let's bail out the bankers, let's not do what we should have done in Iceland, for example. We didn't actually properly look at the failures of the economic structure. You spent huge amounts of public money to protect the structure that let the banks do what they did. And then off the back of the banking crisis that was caused by bankers, we then immediately put the strain of that onto the working people of this country. There was no what recovery? We never recovered. It's a lie. It's a complete lie. He's lying again and again and again.
Have the Ukraine and the surge in energy prices. So there are real issues that have hit the British economy. But I think this government has handled all those crises extremely well.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Well, it's a good question from Robbie. And if you think through public services, nearly all of them rely heavily on the moral exploitation of public sector workers to work beyond their hours, to work at nights, work at weekends, just to keep them going. Look, in every single service. I was talking to a group of doctors last week who, albeit on strike outside the hospital, they were just telling me the pressures and strains they're under just to keep the hospital going. And they are paid £14 an hour for that. They could earn more money.
Junior
doing
doctors,
almost well, junior doctors. These are people in their 30s who've spent 9 years training to get £14 an hour. It's not fair.
God, this man was too fucking good for this shit country. He was too good for this country. The people of Britain do not fucking deserve Jeremy Corbyn. He's too good for them. Right? They deserve the fucking shit country that they've got. They got what they fucking wanted. I'm sorry. Right? Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland fucking leave. And leave the shithole of England to the doom that it quite frankly deserves.
Not right. Look at care service. It is a complete nightmare. If your elderly relative, father, mother, grandfather, whatever, needs social care, very limited, very hard to get, and you would end up with one of your family members probably giving up work in order to care for them. We don't have an effective care service. No, the services are not working because we're not investing enough in them, and in the case of the NHS and the care sector, we're allowing the private sector to take too much out of them through privatisation within the NHS and the privatisation of care services. We need investment in public services that are publicly run.
Can I just say, the challenges with public...
No notes, 100%, straight facts.
Existing public services, and they're not perfect. I do push back on people that say that they're absolutely not working, but the challenges are not always economic, by the way. And I think it's very important to recognise that sometimes it's about the need for reform, sometimes it's about the need to find better ways of doing things. And I always get very nervous when somebody says, well, the solution must be more money, firstly. Secondly, when there is an economic imperative or fiscal...
it's almost like maybe if we'd actually properly increased NHS spending as a percentage of GDP during the austerity period, we wouldn't be in this mess we're in the first place. If we'd not instituted the Landsler reforms, if we'd not instituted the internal market reforms that devastated it, if we hadn't spent millions of pounds shelling out on private contracts for NHS hospitals, so we're paying money for providing the service and also paying off shareholders at the same time whilst providing a worse service. If we hadn't sold off huge sections of the NHS to Centene and Virgin Care, maybe we wouldn't be in this position at the same time, right? Maybe we wouldn't have to continue to put more money into it if the money wasn't being spent in such a ridiculous and corrupt way that it is right now, quite frankly. God, this man I hate Conservatives so much. They just destroy the country for the benefit of their mates. I hate them.
I'm just
need
talking
for
about money taken
investment.
out of the services.
When there's a need for further investment, we always have to recognise that money must come from somewhere, right? And so it's either people get taxed more, or we borrow more, or we find efficiencies in other places. So there are always trade-offs in public services, and I often feel like the political class needs to be a bit more honest about what the possible is when you're trying to make decisions.
But Samuel,
about
you've got
services.
private sector organisations in care and the NHS and in local government sucking resources out of our public service. £35 billion on track and trace. Where did it all go?
I don't know.
I'll leave that question.
You fucking tell him. You tell him, Jez. You fucking get him. Get him. 500 million of our money goes to NHS trusts, goes on interest to private firms for NHS infrastructure. Exactly. It's ridiculous. It's absolutely fucking ridiculous.
Nick, no, because we're running very, very late. I just want to say, Nicola, who's listening in Italy, says, I live in Italy and we had the COVID epidemic as well, but I can see my GP the same day or the day after.